How many years? How many times? The answers to those questions are the pursuits of lifetimes. Yet often we don't even have time between working and playing, errands and entertainment. We don't even have time to consider the questions for long. The answers may have a chance to come when the questions can really knock around in minds ready to consider them. Being centered, stepping out of the day-to-day rush of things, we have the opportunity to make the world different rather than participating in its constant frenzy. So this morning I invite you to find a centered position in your chair. Feet on the ground if that's something you can do. Balanced and steady. Take a moment to clear your mind of fleeting thoughts, to focus on your breathing. And listen to this ancient story retold by Salela Towler, a story about all of us. There was once a highly educated and somewhat arrogant student of the way. Upon hearing that an old sage lived nearby, he decided to visit so he could show off his great depth of knowledge in hopes of gaining some new tidbit to add to his resume. When he arrived at the sage's home, he was surprised to find it but a humble hut. Inside, an old man with a long, wispy beard and bright, shining eyes sat over a tea kettle, humming to himself. Presently, he looked up and, upon seeing the student outside his door, bade him enter his hut. He then sat the student down in the place of honor and asked the student to join him in some tea. They sat, and while the student boasted about his education, recounted his many accomplishments, the old master began to fill his guest's teacup. As the student rambled on, so too did the old master keep pouring tea into his cup until the hot tea overflowed across the table and poured onto the student's lap. "What are you doing, you old dolt?" he shrieked, leaping from his chair. "You're spilling tea everywhere. Can't you see that my cup is already full?" The sage calmly stopped pouring tea and looked at him. "Your mind, sir, is much like this teacup. I'm afraid it is already too full for me to be able to fit anything else into it. Else it will surely run over and spill everywhere." In this culture of ours, constant onrush of tasks and things to do and messages to us, may we remember to leave room, to make room in our cups for the questions. Amen. In 1963, Valley Unitarian Universalist Church, now congregation, began meeting as a conversation group in a Tempe pizza restaurant, though the church wasn't officially chartered until 1965. The 60s were a time of great change for this liberal faith of ours. In fact, it was in 1961 that the Unitarian Universalist Church of America merged with the American Unitarian Association to form the Unitarian Universalist Association. These two denominations were not a match made in heaven. Now, that's not necessarily because of their differing theologies, though they were different even in 1961. Colloquially, I suppose, the Universalists talked about God more than the Unitarians, at least some of them did, although Scotty might quibble with me. We'll meet Scotty in a minute. The Unitarians weren't sure about the theological statements that the Universalists were fond of making. Where the Unitarians emphasized freedom to pursue truth, the Universalists emphasized the transforming power of love and community, although each emphasized the other. But long before 1961, Unitarian and Universalist ministers in formation were attending many of the same seminaries, coming to many of the same conclusions about religion. Still, the merger of these two great free religious traditions required 100 years of wrangling. What kept them apart for so long? The answer is complicated, but there is no doubt social class was a factor. This morning, I want to explore how social class affected Unitarian Universalism then and how it continues to do so. My colleague and Valley UU member, Reverend Scotty Meek, served this congregation as an extension minister for a brief time about 30 years ago. He was ordained in 1959 before the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists as a Universalist minister. It is my honor to invite Scotty to reflect on his experience as a Universalist minister at the time of the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists. Reverend Meek, welcome. Right here.
I guess I won't need this. I mistakenly thought that the Patriots were playing today, but they're not. The first time that I heard the hymn Rank by Rank was in Symphony Hall in Boston at the time of the consolidation between the Unitarians and the Universalists. Tears streamed down my face then. And I held back tears again this morning. I was a student at Tufts University, the Crane Theological School, during the years leading up to merger. And we say merger. I prefer the word consolidate, because we were, as Andy suggests, not a harmonious group of people in those early days, no more than we are today. We overlook the fact that the young people in our movement, the members of the American Unitarian Youth and the Universalist Youth Fellowship, joined together in the new organization called the Liberal Religious Youth several years before their parents decided that it was a good idea to get together. There was another organizational matter that occurred in advance of the formation of the Unitarian Universalist Association, It was called the Council of Liberal Churches. I don't know how many of you remember that. It seems to be a forgotten part of our history. Ernest Kubler was the director of that organization, and many people thought that he should become the first president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. But the committee that met for several years prior to the consolidation developed a set of guidelines for the two groups to come together. There were some basic differences in the organizational pattern. The Unitarians had been gathered in small geographic groups called councils, while the Universalists had been gathered in state conventions, such as the Massachusetts Universalist Convention, which was probably the largest gathering of Universalists in the country at the time. They used to say that 2/3 of the Unitarians and the Universalists were in New England, and 3/4 of the 2/3 was in Massachusetts. So we were hardly a continental movement. When Gordon McKeeman was running for the presidency of the UUA, he figured that the geographic center of Unitarian Universalism was in Elmira, New York. But eventually, we got to the point of meeting in 1959 in Syracuse, New York, appropriately in the War Memorial Auditorium, to hammer out the final details of the consolidation, and the Unitarians would vote on something and immediately call the Universalists who were gathered in another part of the building and report the results, and then the Universalists would call the Unitarians when they had voted on something. And so we progressed together, but separately, through to the point where, in the end, we said, yeah, let's do it. And 2 years later, we don't do anything quickly. In Boston, in Symphony Hall, the consolidating meeting took place. The committee of Unitarians and Universalists who, cleared the way for this final vote had a number of things that they recommended, and most of them were readily accepted. One of the proposals that they made, however, was that neither of the then presiding officers of the Unitarians and the Universalists should run for the presidency of the new organization. Philip Randall Giles, who was the general superintendent of the Universalist Church of America, readily agreed that was a good idea, and so he did not allow his name to be brought forth for consideration for the presidency. Dana McLean Greeley, however, who was at that time the president of the American Unitarian Association, said nonsense. And so he allowed his name to be submitted, and he ran, and he was elected. And that was the final straw as far as some of Universalists were concerned. But he served 2 terms as our first president, and a commemorative medal was struck in his honor at the end of his term, and I carry that coin, well, I don't carry it, I have it in my possession at home still to this day. So I prefer to think of myself in the British language as part of the, what's the term I use? Well, I can't remember the term. The Royal Opposition, thank you, that's it, yeah. And I have completed more than 50 years in the ministry. I have attended every General Assembly since 1959, and this year will be the first time that I miss that annual event. I had a point to make when I said that. One of the problems with being 85 years old is that your memory slips. Well, no matter. I'll think of it this afternoon when Dorothy's driving me home. The other thing, I know what it was. I have voted in every presidential election since the beginning of the UUA, and I have never successfully chosen the winning candidate. I think that's an unchallenged record. Probably the only record I have. It's been a pleasure sharing with you this morning. It's been a long time since I have stood in the pulpit, and I hope it's a long time before I stand here again.
We'd like it not to be so long, but you know, the real miracle, you can see why I love Reverend Meek, by the way, is that Scotty is a Patriots fan, and I'm a Colts fan, and I'm feeling a little bit deflated this morning. Anyway, that's not what I came here to talk to you about. The way, before what Reverend Meek was talking about even, the way early American Universalist and Unitarian congregations came into being helps tell the story of the class differences between the two faiths. Many of the Unitarian congregations were formed by Puritans before the formation of the United States. Those congregations that became Unitarian were established and, in a way, handed from generation to generation. Came to include some of the most influential people in especially East Coast society where most of them were located. As Reverend Mark Harris writes in his book, Elite, Uncovering Classism in Unitarian Universalist History, quote, in 1850, 2/3 of the wealthiest Bostonians were Unitarians. By 1870, the average Unitarian was 13 times richer than the average member of any other denomination, end quote. The Universalists were a somewhat different story. 5 years ago, I was tipped off by the editor of the little newspaper in the small town in Indiana where I was serving that there was an old Universalist church building in a nearby town, if you can call it that. I drove way out in the country and found a little brick church sitting on the edge of a farm field. It had tragically been converted into apartments, but the cornerstone read, Universalist Church. It was begun by a farmer, mainly for his family, as a result of a revival. Universalist churches sprouted up all over in the 19th and early 20th centuries, often because a Universalist minister came into town preaching the love of God, preaching that there was no eternal punishment and that all people were acceptable in God's sight. It makes sense that most of the early converts to Universalism were Baptists. who had been raised on the notion of a finger-wagging, soul-damning God. Universalism had its root in revivals preached not by the literati, for sure, but by evangelists. Still, think about the similarities in these theologies, Unitarian and Universalist. Unitarians preach the freedom and power of the human person to find God's truth in the world. Universalists preach God's accepting love of all people. It's sometimes said that Universalists believed God was too good to damn people, and Unitarians believed people were too good to be damned. But either way you go, you get to a similar place. Even still, social class was an enormous obstacle. Historian Peter Hughes writes, "It is not that the Universalists were never learned or rich, they often became so. While an intelligent Unitarian went to Harvard or some other prestigious school by right of birth, a bright Universalist, through luck and hard work, might get into a more modest educational institution. More often, the bulk of a Universalist's culture was achieved almost entirely through his or her own effort. Unitarians, at least in New England, often inherited their churches from generations past. With very few exceptions, Universalists created their own societies and built their own meeting houses. So it was that these prejudices, in some ways, had veins that ran down through time to the merger of the two movements in 1961. When the sitting Unitarian president, as Scotty detailed, became president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, many Universalists felt that their fear of being swallowed up by Unitarianism had come true. But the leaven of Universalist theology keeps us grounded in a theology of love. As historian Charles Howe writes, the principles, the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, are grounded in varying degrees in both the Universalist and the Unitarian traditions. The first principle, affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every person, is predominantly Universalist in character, rooted historically in the conviction that all are worthy of salvation. Similarly, the fourth principle, affirming the need for a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, has a predominantly Unitarian ring to it, reflecting the traditional Unitarian stress on learning and intellect. And while the goal of world community, identified in the sixth principle, certainly is strongly rooted in the Unitarian tradition, it clearly comes out of the global humanism and one world religion emphasized in much of 20th century Universalist theology. Today, more than 50 years later, Universalism is visibly present in our movement. Some see the merging of Unitarianism and Universalism as a merging of head and heart. We still value the intellect. We'll always prize human reason. But it seems to me emotion has reclaimed its proper place in our faith alongside. Still, important questions remain. Who are Unitarian Universalists today when it comes to social class? It's notoriously difficult to measure. What is social class anyway? That's a question that is active. Is it income? It is, but it's more than that. Is it education? Is it the kind of work you do, whether or not you work with your hands? It is, and more than that, too. Sociologists Christian Smith and Robert Ferris measured social class in religion using 4 measures back in 2005. Income, degrees held, years of education, and job prestige. In percentage holding advanced degrees, Unitarian Universalists rank first among religious groups that they measure. We also rank first in years of education as a mean among our members. We're second among religions in household income, and we're second in the ranking of job prestige. We are primarily, though not exclusively, a religion of middle and upper middle class people. Way back in 1929, Richard Niebuhr wrote about the way Americans group themselves along social class lines in religion in his book, The Social Sources of Denominationalism. He grieved what he saw as a failing of Christianity to bring people together across social class lines. That's still true. We're still divided in large part this way. And we're still asking the question, what can we do to be more inclusive across social class lines? The answer is not a program, not a book to read or a sermon to be preached. The answer is relationship. Mark Harris asked the question in his book about classism and Unitarian Universalism, can we change? He answers that if we do, it won't be because the denomination orders it, what in Unitarian Universalism has been because the association ordered it, or because of, quote, a bunch of white liberals feeling guilty that their congregation is not diverse. He writes, it will require personal connections, and it will require sharing power and control. And it will require our being open to people across the social class and education spectrum. I'm working on a Doctor of Ministry degree with an emphasis on social class and Unitarian Universalism. I'm interested in that work partly because of my own story. I was raised in the Pentecostal church, a church that Niebuhr would have called a religion of the disinherited, mostly poor and working class people. And now here I am in this movement with a very different social class identity. And friends, the theological switch for me was a piece of cake compared with the change in social class. I came up against what French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu calls social habitus. Social habitus is the product of the way you were raised. Bourdieu says your social location in your growing up years results in particular tastes and interests, from the sports you watch to the hobbies you enjoy, the music you listen to, the television shows you watch, a social class habitat in which you're most comfortable. When I came into Unitarian Universalist ministry, another minister said to me, I've never had a colleague who drives a pickup and likes to fish. My habitat was somewhat different than most of my colleagues' habitats. Some days the transition was painful, but not always. But what drew me and sustained me while I was finding my way was our emphasis on love and social justice. That's why I believe this movement of ours can be a great symbol of hope when it comes to social class. I think we have the potential to remind the world that although we may come from different social classes, although we may have different social habitats, we join one another in the human need to make meaning. It's in our history. Our Universalist theology has ingrained this in us. This is why we look to widen our circle of meaning-making more and more. How? By doing what we do best, I think, by working toward justice, and by doing so in relationship with the very people we seek to serve. So let us, together, look to widen our circle, broader and broader, across social class lines. I am thrilled to be doing that work with a group like you. Amen.